Okay, cool. All right, Joe. So I'm gonna record this onto YouTube for y'all, and we're gonna let it be. So let me do one thing here, and I will share the link. Dope. So let me open the VS Code window. All right, y'all. So, like I mentioned, I want to kind of go through some of the more important aspects of why JavaScript is useful. And last time we kind of linked up, we kind of got installed. We got our JavaScript installation going. We got Node on our computer. We talked about the browser a bit and the Google Chrome developer tools and set up VS Code and all of the core things that you need to kind of get started working with JavaScript. But now I kind of want to talk about the application of JavaScript. Like why would we use JavaScript in any context in a programming sense, right? And so hopefully today will make sense for those of y'all who've spent some time looking at like the HTML, CSS stuff before. The reason it's not like I'm gonna go through it kind of quickly is because a lot of the front end structure changes when you start working with React. Not too much, not too terribly much. Like you still use certain things that are reminiscent of like working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in a vanilla context, but enough of it changes that it makes less sense for me to focus so much on that and actually then to just talk more about the JavaScript that's like underlying like what's going on in a typical kind of web application. So yeah, so today I'm just going to show you kind of a regular vanilla JavaScript HTML CSS application, and then from there we're gonna try to build that real quick together, and then from there kind of just we'll talk at a high level of what's going on with the JavaScript, and then hopefully give you some time to just understand that, soak that in a little bit, and maybe even work on something for yourself with like regular JavaScript. And then next time we link, hopefully we'll just dive right into the React stuff so that you can feel a little bit more confident with working with React. Cool. Sound good? If it sounds good, just give me a thumbs up so I know you're rocking with me, and we're gonna kind of just kick it off. All right. Okay. Groovy. Let me close my mailbox so y'all don't see all the spam that I've been getting. I recently installed some cryptocurrency related applications onto my computer and phone, and mysteriously, as soon as I did that, a bunch of spam started in. I'm like, dang, y'all really out here. I don't even know how this works that y'all out here like that. Okay, what's the best way for me to do this? Okay, let's do this. All right, bet. You should see my VS Code window. It says like welcome screen. I hit a thumbs up that you see that. Great, thank you. Appreciate y'all. Cool. So last time we got set up with VS Code, right? Visual Studio Code is essentially a text editor. We use it to code. We use it to write code. One of the dope things about VS Code, like I mentioned to y'all last time, was that it allows you to work with a number of different types of languages. And it also has a number of dope extensions that make programming work very easy when you, depending on like what you're working on. So a lot of people really like VS Code. It's a really developer-friendly text editor. Most text editors are developer-friendly, but this one, Atom, Sublime Text, I used to use Sublime Text. VS Code is like my personal favorite. I really rock with it. So yeah, whether it's regular JavaScript, HTML, CSS, or even like a React, I use just VS Code. So if you have like VS Code as your first text editor, you're in good company. Cool. So today I kind of want to show you just like walking through a simple kind of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript project. One thing I'm going to need in order to make things work is just, I got to open a new Chrome window. Let me just drag that back over here. We'll use that in a little bit. And cool. So let's say I was trying to build a new website today, like just off rip. I'm trying to build a new HTML, CSS, and JavaScript project. How would I go about doing that, right? So again, VS Code can kind of be a little tricky when you first get started with it because of the way that it uses its integrated terminal. So I'm going to just kind of show you a good standard approach that I would take if I was starting a new project, specifically on VS Code, right? So when I first open the app, it opens to this welcome screen. My first thing that I like to do when I start a new project is create a folder for the project so that it lives somewhere on my machine, right? So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just gonna do that real quick. So there's a couple different ways to do it. You know what I'm saying? There's not like just one way, but one easy way is you could go to File and just click Open. And Open will open up, you know, the little kind of Finder on if you're on a Mac, or like just the File Explorer if you're on Windows. And so these are just like my regular folders on my machine, right? So I could go very easily to my desktop, for instance. I got a bunch of screenshots because Max put all the screenshots on the Mac on the desktop. But say, for instance, I wanted to create a new project, right? I could just make a new folder inside of my desktop. And I'm going to call it, we're going to be building Tic-Tac-Toe. So I'm going to build the Tic-Tac-Toe game. So I'm just going to call the folder Tic-Tac-Toe, right? So this is going to be my project folder. So it's completely empty right now, but now I have this new folder that I created through VS Code. And when I open this, VS Code reopens, it like relaunches the window that you had open very specifically to that folder that you just created. They added this really dope security feature to ask you if you want to automatically trust the authors of particular folders and files that you open. They do this for security purposes to make sure that you don't just run code that could be containing malicious pieces of code and software and stuff. I think it's a pretty dope feature. But because I'm the one writing this, I can tell myself like, yeah, I'm gonna trust myself. I trust myself. So now I got this pretty dope blank template of a project, right? Just a blank folder that I opened in VS Code. The reason why I like going that way versus just opening a new file and writing a new file is if I open the terminal in VS Code now, right? So VS Code has an integrated terminal inside of it. That's one of the things that makes it pretty dope. You can click open a new terminal from the terminal drop-down menu, and you should get a little terminal that pulls up from the bottom. And on that terminal, right, if I were to look at kind of the path, right, I'm inside of that folder that I just created, right? So printing the working directory, you can see that I'm inside of my desktop folder, inside of that folder Tic-Tac-Toe that I created. And clearly there's no files in there because it was an empty folder. So a bunch of students always have issues like setting up the VS Code terminal. Like they think they're in the right folder, but they're not in the right folder. So my biggest piece of advice is always just start a new project folder. Or, you know, later I'll show you how to do that from the command line and just like start everything from the command line. If I don't start a project this way, I would normally just start it from the command line, which is helpful too. But we'll go over that later. So in a typical kind of like front end web dev project, right? There's a couple of different components that you would use, right? You'd use HTML, you'd use CSS, and you use JavaScript, right? HTML is basically like the skeleton of your web page. I like to think of it like it's the structure of things. It's you know, head, body, arms, and legs kind of thing. And literally the head and body are part of the HTML document. So at the end of the day, you use HTML to define what elements are going to be on your web page, what elements are going to be on your body, right? Then CSS is more like this, it's the style, right? We all kind of, everybody I think knows that CSS is more stylistic, is more design related, and that's very true. CSS is what tells the HTML how those various elements should be graphically displayed in a design context. So Anything related to like sizing, color, position, layout, stuff like that is CSS. And then JavaScript is really like, I think of like the brains of the web page, right? It's the when this thing happens, what happens next? Or if a user does this, then do this, right? Anything that relates to like logic or like kind of something happening after something else, JavaScript is really where you would be spending your time defining all of that stuff out for. And yeah, so that's kind of like how those three things relate. And again, I'm sorry, I might be going through this a little bit fast. You know, I'll definitely upload more videos or more content related to just like regular HTML and CSS stuff. But for right now, because I'm trying to focus more on getting the JavaScript together so that we can transition that conversation into a conversation about React, I'm gonna just kind of go through it as a little quick. Cool. So like we mentioned, three elements that we need to kind of define for ourselves if we were building out a web page, right? Typically, you might see a folder structure inside it. So say this is my project folder, right? This Tic-Tac-Toe folder that I created, right? You might see a file structure that reflects those three components of your web page, right? So you might see a folder for all of your CSS inside of the project, and it might just be a folder called CSS, right? So I'm using this add folder icon here in VS Code, right? That if you click, you can add a new folder very easily. And then this one on the left is a new file icon in VS Code. So we're gonna see like a CSS folder most times. You might also see a JavaScript folder. And that might be called just simply like something like JS, right? These are empty folders inside of this folder. In a second, we'll add some code inside of them to start working on them. But the most important file that you're gonna see, no matter what, excuse me, no matter what kind of web dev project you're working on, so long as it's a project like that's gonna be a front end facing project, you're always gonna see some HTML file that's going to be the file that your users end up seeing, right? It's going to be the base HTML, for lack of better words. And so normally we call the base HTML file the index file. Index has a specific context in the web dev community where any file that's named index typically is a file that gets looked for first. So when the browser's looking through all your folders and trying to figure out what file to show first, it'll typically look for an index. So if you have index.html, we're telling the browser, hey, look, this is the first HTML file that you should try to open if we ever open this folder up in a server, which we're actually going to do in a little bit. Cool. So I have kind of an index.html. I have a CSS folder and a JavaScript folder. I probably should define some files for that. So let's just go ahead and do that real quick. So inside of the JavaScript file folder, I'm going to create a new file. So more little shortcuts for VS Code. If you right click on a folder, it'll allow you to add a new file or add a new folder inside of the one that's highlighted. So if I click new file, it's gonna add a new file inside of this JavaScript folder that I just created. So I'm gonna create a new file called main.js. We'll get into that in a second. But then in the CSS, I'm gonna also right click on the CSS folder and create another file called style.css. And cool. And these would be kind of the typical files you would expect to see inside of regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript projects. Some HTML, some JavaScript, and some CSS. Great. So I'm going to focus on the HTML part first and just kind of build out a kind of rough HTML skeleton for this particular project that we're going to work on. And then we're going to spend more time talking about the JavaScript. So again, I'm sorry that I'm going to kind of go through it a little quick. Trust me, I will give y'all more resources specifically for HTML and CSS later. It just so happens that it's pretty HTML and CSS are topics that take a good amount of time to just talk about from the beginning. But they're also the types of things that there's a lot of documentation and resources on for folks who are interested. Cool. So we're going to be building kind of like a tic-tac-toe game. I want to shout out Anna Elizabeth, who wrote a really dope Medium article about using JavaScript to build out tic-tac-toe. So I thought that her Medium article, which I'll probably link again for everybody to take a look at, is a really dope kind of like dope walkthrough of like everything that I'm going to talk about in a quicker sense. The only thing that I'm going to be doing is just providing more context to some of what's going on in real time. And so, yeah, I encourage y'all to follow her and also maybe look at more of her tutorials too, if you like this one, for instance. But yeah, cool. So with these 3 files, the idea here is that, you know, like I said, HTML, this is our skeleton. So we're going to have to start with defining the skeleton so that everything else kind of makes sense. In the process, I'm going to introduce a couple of terms and things that are going to be important for y'all to understand about what's going on behind the scenes. So again, pardon me for speeding through these parts, but hopefully even in just the context of what I'm saying, it'll make sense to you and you'll get a little bit of a better picture of what's going on in here. So HTML is a very interesting language, right? Hypertext markup language is what HTML stands for. HTML is comprised of what we call hypertext, and it basically is just different elements that have their own tags. The HTML syntax is kind of weird. It's kind of funky. I still don't know a good way to describe, you know, less than, greater than sign syntax to folks. So I just kind of colloquially say it's the peace signs. You know what I'm saying? You put your HTML inside the peace signs and you need your peace signs, or else HTML is going to be like, hey, bro, you ain't cool. What's going on? You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of just the syntax for HTML. That gets a little tricky for folks who are working with it for the first time, because you're like trying to figure out, where do I close this? Where do I close that? We nest elements in HTML. So things can become a mess pretty quickly. But the basic rule of thumb is for every element that you create, you have to close that element's tag. So that would be like your right-hand peace sign, and your left-hand peace sign would be like opening the tag. But certain elements close in a specific way, where others close in a more kind of single line, easy to understand way. Like some elements make it easy to close the tag. Others, you have to really purposefully say, I'm closing the tag here. So we'll see that in a second as I start building out a kind of scaffolded HTML document. So HTML itself is pretty simple in terms of like the overall structure. What gets complicated about HTML is the very particular inner components and elements that you choose to use. So the simple kind of HTML structure starts off with a declaration of the document being an HTML document. And it looks a little something like this. And I'll zoom in a little bit because I'm sure y'all can't really see this. Maybe I zoomed in too much. Let me see. Can you see? Is this good for y'all?
Yes.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Cool. So this is kind of just a declaration of this document that I'm writing to be a HTML document. This is kind of just letting it know that that's the particular format of this document. The next important HTML tag that you need to use is actually the HTML tag. So the HTML tag itself is a tag that really kind of defines everything underneath it to be HTML. And so I'm just gonna open that real quick. As you can see, one of the dope things about VS Code is it automatically creates the closing tag for you. It's dope when you expect it to do that, but when you don't expect it to do that, I could imagine that for a lot of people, it becomes a little bit overwhelming, because like sometimes you don't want it to close, but it'll close for you. So you know, it's a helpful trick that VS Code does for you. So just be mindful that sometimes it'll close the tag automatically for you. And so this is what I was talking about when I say opening and closing intentionally. So this is the opening tag of an HTML element, and this is the closing tag. You can tell this is a closing tag because of the / that it's using here. Elements in HTML can be nested. So basically what this element's doing, another dope feature of VS Code is if you hover over anything that you're typing in there, it'll give you a nice little developer reference that kind of talks to you a little bit more about what you're looking at. So it says here, the HTML element represents the root of an HTML document. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means to be the root of the document in a bit. But for the most part, what I want you to understand is that everything that we put inside of this is going to be kind of us defining all of the different elements inside of our HTML file. So every HTML file, no matter what you're looking at, is going to have these elements. The other two elements that every HTML file is going to have that you just need to be aware of is an element called the head, and then another element called the body. The head is an HTML element that is important for collecting metadata for the document. So metadata, the word meta in any context is referring to something's awareness of itself, right? We say something super meta when it's like making you think deep about something that is otherwise unconscious, right? Like me talking about language while speaking is pretty meta because it's me reflecting on myself at the same time that I'm talking, right? Metadata for anything is also like information that the thing knows about itself that it can communicate to other things, right? So a good example, there's a lot of different examples of metadata that we'll see in a second that are the types of things that you would put in the HTML head. The HTML body, this is where like every piece of content or the visual aspects of your HTML, the actual elements themselves go. This is where you would define all of those things. And yeah, the purpose of the head and body are different, but they are both necessary for, they're both necessary for your documents. And yeah, so let me see. Cool. And can y'all just do me a favor, if you're not speaking, just stay on mute for a bit. That would be helpful. I appreciate you, because I keep hearing something that sounds like somebody about to talk, but I don't think anybody got anything to say. Appreciate y'all. Cool. So what we're gonna do is kind of just define out these HTML elements, and this is the part that I was saying, like, I'm gonna go a little bit quicker on because I don't want to spend this whole class talking only about the HTML. But for instance, when we talk about the head, right, like I mentioned, the head is where we would put metadata, right? The metadata that we define in the head is more often than not just information that's important for the document to know about itself, right? So some good examples of that might be we use meta tags to define out that information. So example of a meta tag that is used on most websites is the character set, which basically just defines what in character encoding are we going to use, right? So normally we are encouraged to use UTF-8, which is just a specific file encoding, and we would use all of this metadata very specifically for defining things like that, so that the page knows, okay, cool, all of the characters that are being used on this page are like using UTF-8. Go ahead, bro. You had a question.
Do you not want us to use the exclamation shortcut?
You can use it if that's what you choose to do. I'm just kind of showing you as if you were doing it without knowledge of those things.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, no, great question. Cool. Dope. Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of different shortcuts that you can use in VS Code to get started with HTML templates. I'm just kind of showing you as if you were looking at this for the first time, but maybe later I'll show more of those little shortcuts. I encourage you to drop it in the Slack too. If you find some cool shortcuts that you like, you can feel free to drop it in the community and whatnot. So yeah, I'm just gonna drop a couple different things in here. And once we have it all together, I might just talk back about it. So I just defined like the character set. I'm just gonna throw a couple other meta tags in there that just make this a little bit more of a formal HTML document that we could take a look at. So I just forgot my closing tag here. This one, we're defining the viewport. And we're going to define a couple other properties of the viewport. So like things like setting the width to become equal to the device width, and setting the initial scale of the device to be at 1. So it's kind of just kind of zoomed in at regular kind of zoom. And we'll throw another couple meta tags in here. Let's see. Matter of fact, I'll just stop there. The whole idea of meta tags is that we would put information that the page might want to know about itself. Some other types of meta tags that you might put in here relate to like SEO and things like that. You could put meta tags that would be used for SEO, search engine optimization algorithms to find information about your page too. So maybe at another point we'll talk about those things. Another very important tag that you normally see in the head is the title, which kind of creates a title for your web page on the browser. So I'm going to just add a title. I'm just going to call it Tic-Tac-Toe. And cool, I'm going to save that. And inside of the body now, I'm going to just kind of, for the sake of just getting something up to see, I'm just going to just put Tic-Tac-Toe. And I just use an element that's called a heading, right? H1. A heading is basically just like a large formatted text. So hopefully that'll just show some text up on the screen. And cool. So this is technically a very basic HTML page, right? We have some stuff in the head. Sometimes you would see this without even any metadata, right? You might just only see the title. It's not as important to have all the metadata. It's only important if it's important for what you're building, right? So I don't really need all of that metadata if I wanted the page to work. That was just for me, just giving y'all some examples of typical things that you would see in the metadata context. But even this in and of itself is a pretty basic HTML file that would still work, right? We have elements defined in the head, we have elements defined in the body. So how do you go about kind of seeing your HTML code, right? Well, that's the job of a web browser, right? Remember a while ago, we started talking about, how the web works and what goes on behind the scenes, what happens when we go to a web page, when we type a URL and press enter. We talked about DNS, we talked about all of that stuff. Remember, one of the last things that happened was after the request got made, our computer would reach out to another computer, say, hey, I'm looking for this web page. That computer would send you some information in the form of an HTML document, and then your browser would show it, right? So you can use your web browser to look at HTML code, right? So if I were to open this file, this index.html file in my browser, I would see what's going on in it right now. So if I just go to my browser, click open file, and look in my desktop for this folder that I created one called Tic-Tac-Toe, and I open this index.html file, right? Well, now I can look at this file, right? And it's kind of cool because I could use my browser to take a look at it. Same things that we were talking about before. I could use the developer tools and inspect everything and just make sure that everything is working as I would expect it to. In this case, we only added really one element in there. So, that element shows up. And we can inspect it a little bit more. But of course, what you will want to do is add more. So let's just go ahead and do that. And at the same time, as we're doing that, we're going to just kind of see some stuff happen. So I'm still in my VS Code. I'm just going to add a couple more elements inside of here. I'm going to add an H2, and I'm going to say, if we're building Tic-Tac-Toe, we might as well let somebody know whose turn it is. So H2 is another heading. It's just a slightly smaller one. I'm gonna say it's X's turn, right? Save that. And if I go back to my page, oh, well, nothing shows up. Well, that's because this version that it's showing of this file was an old version. So once I refresh the page, I can see those changes get made. And you know, that could be pretty annoying, right? To have to continuously reload, refresh to see all of the changes take place in from this particular file. And that's one of the reasons why people would host their HTML code on a server, right? Because if I was pulling this information from a particular from a server, I might be able to see the changes occur a little bit more in real time. And so one of the cool things about that JavaScript tutorial that I encourage y'all to do, this one that we're kind of working through, it talks about how you can install a particular package in your VS Code. You can look for an extension called Live Server. That is a really dope extension that lets you launch a local server for development purposes. And the Live Server is a pretty cool package that was that a lot of web devs use. You can see it has like 15 million downloads. But it's really dope because it lets you kind of launch a server inside of your folder, and you can use that you can use that server to see all of your files a little bit more changing in a little bit more real time, right? So I have the Live Server extension already downloaded, but if you wanted to download it, you could go to the extensions, and this goes for any extension in VS Code. You can click this little like puzzle piece looking icon here on the left, or you can you know, navigate to it from view and then go to extensions. Both will take you to this screen here, and you could just type in the name of the extension that you want. So if I were looking for Live Server, I would just type in Live Server, and the first one that pulls up is probably the one that you want. This one's created by Ritwick Gay, and that server is the one that I have installed that I'll show y'all real quick. The Live Server is really dope because it allows us to create a server inside of this folder that will allow us to see the files inside of this folder a little bit easier from the browser. So in order to run the Live Server, typically it has like the extension adds something to the bottom of your screen that lets you open a server up. But sometimes it doesn't show up. I forget why it doesn't do that for me. But so typically what I would do is just right click on the file that I want to show up, which in this case is my index.html file. And I can say open with Live Server. And when I do that, it opens up now a different URL, right? At first it was opening this very specific file path. Now it's opening IP address, right? To my local machine running on localhost in this particular index.html file. So now if I make some other changes, right? If I say it's O's turn now, and I go back to my server, right? You can see that it's reloading a little bit more easily, like kind of what you would really expect, right? So in a development sense, it's very helpful to have a server running because you can see your changes happen in real time. I said 0, but it's supposed to be O. So yeah, that's the Live Server. And in React, we definitely make use of these development servers to make our work process easier to kind of see changes happening in real time. But it's important to know that that's not really unique to React. That's just the idea of creating a server that allows us to take a look at our files and manipulate them in real time while being connected to our browser or whatnot. Cool. So I'm just going to go back to it being X's turn, and let's just build out this kind of tic-tac-toe game board and talk a little bit, get off of this topic of HTML and talk a little bit more about CSS. One of the most important kind of elements that you see used in every website is this element called a div, which a div stands kind of, I think it stands for like divider, but it really is, like this says here, divs are kind of funny. They have no meaning. It says like they have no special meaning at all. A div is really like a container. I like to think of it like it's an element that you use to wrap other elements in in groups, and like you can use a div to style and to manipulate a lot of different elements all at once. So it's very a helpful element, but it has no meaning because all it really does is allow you to interact with whatever elements you put inside of it, right? Like it says, it's children. And we'll talk also about children. Remember, we said we're going to talk about what it means to be the root, right? This HTML element is talking about root, and then divs are now talking about children. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit after we build out this HTML file. So yeah, let's just finish up this kind of tic-tac-toe game board. I'm going to create a container through this div that's going to basically hold all of the more fine detail components that are important for this particular web page. And in the case of the tic-tac-toe, what would you expect other than like the actual board, right? So let's just build out that board real quick, and you'll see kind of how things kind of work to a degree. So first thing I'm going to do just to get the ball rolling here and connect these things together is I'm going to build a square, right? I'm going to start with the idea of like tic-tac-toe. You already know the vibe. It's kind of like the board is like you know what I'm saying, like three sections, kind of like this, right? And each of the sections are represented as like kind of squares, and you can have X's or you can have O's along the board, right? So we kind of got to build that out in HTML for our user to be able to play it, right? So I'm thinking let's start with one square, and then we'll be able to kind of build the whole grid from there. So how would we do that, right? How would we build out a square, right? I have these divs now, and if I save my page, right, remember that this is supposed to reload with information, but technically we don't see anything. If I were to inspect this though, one thing you notice very quickly, you start working with a lot of HTML, is divs are very interesting. They'll exist in your code, but they won't show up because there's nothing inside of them. When you have divs that are empty, it almost doesn't even render on the page at all, right? So one thing that we could do is add some style or add some elements inside of these divs for it to show up, and we can see some things inside of it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to style the div to represent more of what a square in our board should really be. And the way we do that is by way of connecting our HTML document that we have currently to some CSS, right? And so CSS, remember, is like cascading style sheets. It's all about the style of the HTML element. So now we have this div that we very specifically want to look like a square. So we want to find a way to tell the HTML, hey, like I want you to look like a square, right? And we can do that very easily using CSS. So right now, I'm just going to show you how we would connect our HTML to CSS. And that goes back to how we would work with the head, right? So again, the head is where we would define anything important for the page to be using. So here, outside of things like the title, which I don't think I pointed this out, the title is this little thing at the top of in the top tab, right? It gives the page an actual name, right? So outside of just defining the title, another very important thing that you'll see in most HTML heads is links to various external resources that the HTML needs to know about to serve up things the right way, right? So in this case, what we're going to be creating is a link to our CSS style sheet, which we created in this CSS folder. I created this little style.css file, which we're going to start working with in a second. In order to link pages together, we would use what's called a link tag. The link tag represents an element that allows you to link your document to other resources. Very simple. Links have a very specific syntax where we need to pass what's called an attribute that defines very specific information for this HTML tag. An attribute is basically, think of it like somewhat optional parameters for the tag to use as data. So an example A good example of this we'll see from the link is there's an attribute called href. And the href attribute is an attribute that specifies the URL that this link is going to link to. The thing is that an href, without a link without an href wouldn't work, because we need the link to know, well, what resource are we linking to, for what resource are we linking to, period, right? So we need this href attribute to essentially tell this link, hey, we're going to be linking to the style sheet that's inside of our CSS folder. So this syntax says, hey, we have this folder called CSS, and inside of that folder, we have another file called style.css, and we're going to link to that. Another attribute that can be passed into the link tag is the relationship tag, the relationship attribute, which basically says what is the what kind of relationship does this document have to our current HTML document. So we want to very specifically let this HTML file know that this particular link is to a style sheet. And lastly, we can also tell this link that the type of file that it's looking at is very specifically a text and CSS file. You might be wondering, well, how do you know all of these things? Like where would I even begin to know all of these things? And that's really what these document references are for, right? If you open the document references for any of the things that you're looking at, it'll take you to the Mozilla Developer Network web documents, documentation. And the Mozilla Developer Network is by far an authority in like kind of web dev documentation and technology, right? Mozilla, these are the same people that built Firefox. So they have a lot of information on like best practices for what you would expect for things on the web, right? So here they go in more detail about like what a link tag is doing, why we need the href and relationship tags, and all of those things. So again, HTML can get really deep really quick, but there's a lot of documentation on why you would do certain things very specifically here. Another good resource, I think I mentioned it last class, is the W3schools, which also has a lot of dope resources on anything web dev, HTML, JavaScript. They even have some stuff on React in here somewhere too. They even got stuff, apparently they even got stuff on blockchain stuff too. Really dope. Anyway, back to it. We just added this link tag because we wanted to link our CSS file to our HTML. So this is how we would do that. Now that we have this style sheet linked, we can start adding some CSS that would start customizing our HTML page a little bit more. And just to kind of prove that, I'm going to just write a very simple kind of CSS rule and selector that says, let's change the background, background color of the body of our page to something different. So let's just say blue for right now. So if I save this, go back to my page, you can see everything's blue, right? Which kind of proves that our CSS is linked. I use the body tag, change the background color blue. Of course, that is by far atrocious design, so I'm not going to do that. We're going to add some actual styles that are more specific to what we want to do with this square. So back to the idea of the square. Now we have this set of divs that we want to kind of represent in specific ways. CSS and HTML and CSS get linked together. We just talked a little bit more about attributes. There's a couple other attributes in HTML that are very important to know, especially as we start thinking about like things in like a React-based sense. But again, a lot of these things kind of change very slightly when we start talking about React specifically, which is why I'm only really showing this for the context of what we're doing here. One of those, the attribute that I'm talking about specifically is the class attribute, which allows you to define the class attribute. Let's just see what it says as a reference, is a space separated list of the classes of the element. Classes allow CSS and JavaScript to select and access specific elements via class selectors. or functions like the method document get elements by class name, which we'll talk about in a second. Particularly right here, what we're doing is we're going to create a class name that is going to basically give a unique ID, not give an ID. I don't want to say that either. We're going to basically give our div a code name that we can refer back to. And we're going to give it a name that other divs that are like it can use, which is what a class would be. And so class is one very important attribute. The reason I was getting tongue-tied a little bit is there's another really important attribute that works very similarly to a class type attribute, which is called ID, which an ID attribute also is a unique identifier. But what makes a class versus an ID attribute different is that a class attribute can be reused, and an ID, it has to be unique. Only one element can use ID. But if you have a class, well, you can specify a number of different elements with a class-based attribute. So again, I'm going to just keep going, and let me get to questions in a little bit. But we're going to just add a class-based attribute to this div so that we can refer to it in our CSS, like it said, right? We use classes to refer to the JavaScript, refer to the HTML code in our CSS or JavaScript. So I'm going to give this div a class of square. And the reason why is because I think it makes sense that this div that we're trying to turn into a square gets called a square, right? And we want it to be kind of known as a square. So we can give it a class name that makes that very apparent. So saving this and then going to the CSS, I can add some styles that will make that square kind of come to life a little bit more. In CSS, when you're working with classes, you're going to see this little dot syntax as the identifier for the class. And I can say something like dot square, which will refer to, if we see in CSS, if we hover over any of the CSS rules inside of our code, we're going to see that VS Code gives us some very helpful shortcuts to remind us of what type of element are we going to be targeting with this particular CSS rule. So using the dot syntax is how we would refer to classes. And clearly by saying dot square, we're going to be looking for any element in our HTML page that has a class named square, which is exactly what we want. We want to target that specific div. So I'm just going to give it a couple CSS properties. And again, you probably kind of can figure out what's going on just based off the name alone, but I'll do it real quick and then talk about it in a little bit. So I just want to style that div a little bit and then kind of just show you a little bit more of what CSS would be useful for. So clearly I'm adding a height and a width to our to this particular element. And we should see that kind of change up some things in a second. And I'm just going to give it a couple more properties. And I'm not going to talk too deep about each of them, but essentially what I'm trying to do is make it so that all of these squares are able to be positioned correctly in our page. One thing to know about CSS, unlike HTML, is it's using a completely different syntax, key value pairs, basically, and we end every line with a semicolon. That's very important. Use the curly brace to define the block of CSS, and you have anything on the left of the curly braces is called a selector. So here, this is a selector. This selector is specifically referring to any element with the class name square. So we use CSS to define a selector, and then we give that particular element that it would return, or a set of elements that it returns, some styles. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this. And if I go back, as you can see, I now got this actual nice little square box coming back from that original div that we had, right? So now that I have this square showing up, I'm just gonna add 9 of them, right, to make a tic-tac-toe board. So I got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The benefit of using the class is that by using a class, all of those divs are going to inherit all of those same styles that I just wrote, right? So now we have nine squares in our board. And cool. So to finish this up real quick, because the most important part of this code is not the CSS, it's actually getting into the JavaScript. I'm gonna add a couple more CSS properties and HTML properties to just finish up this board real quick. And then, yeah, I encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to finish through the tutorial, at least this will have gotten you started a little bit, and you might be interested in finishing it up a little bit more on your own time. So I'm gonna add a couple other divs that are important for making the board kind of an actual board. So as you saw when I first reloaded, all of the squares were like in one line, right? Which isn't really what I want. So I want to find a way to make all of those squares kind of be justified into like columns in like a grid. So I'm gonna wrap all of these squares with another kind of container that's going to allow me to define out a little bit more specifically the styles that I want to use. And I'm going to use some more CSS styling to do that. So I'm going to create another CSS class called Flex Container. I'm going to create another one called Flex Wrap, and I'm going to create another one called Flex Column. Important to note is that elements can have multiple class names so long as you have them all contained within a string. And then sometimes you might want to also give elements a specific ID if you know that it's going to be a unique ID. So for instance, I'm going to create this div to actually be very specifically known as the game board. So now that I have these divs, again, nothing really is going to show up too predominantly because there's no real kind of style to them. It's still going to show up kind of like, 9 squares in a line, but by defining these different properties, I'm going to allow for my board to be contained and also to give it some columns and to make it so that all the lines wrap onto one another and give me that kind of tic-tac-toe game board like 3x3x3 that I really want. So let's start defining some more of these CSS rules. So I'm going to define the flex container. And I'm just gonna give the properties that I need. Display flex. I encourage you to take a look at these things. So display flex and stuff are all about positioning. So right now I'm just trying to position all of the items inside of those containers. Trying to give them some specific styling that are going to allow them to show up a little bit of the right way. Matter of fact, before I add the flex column, let's just add the flex container and see what that does. So that just made everything kind of fall back into one line. But now what I really want to do is give everything kind of 3x3 like containers. So do flex column, give it a height, give it a width, and give it a flex direction of column. And let's see what that adds. Not too much change there. So let's add the last one, which was flex wrap, which really will do it for me to create the like wrapping effect that I really am looking for here. So what I'm gonna do is flex wrap and say, hey, I want the flex to wrap, right? It controls whether something is in one line or multi-line. I'm gonna give it a height that's gonna tell it to wrap at a specific height. So I'm gonna say at 432 pixels, and also at a width of 432 pixels as well. So basically I'm defining the square in which I want everything after that height and width to wrap on. And after doing that, we can see we got this nice looking square game board here, which is dope. The last thing I want to do is just give some more specific properties for some of the elements inside of the text-based elements. So I have my I have this H1 and H2 and everything kind of floating. So I'm just gonna give right. I don't want these things just floating to the left like that. I want them kind of in the middle. So I'm gonna add some specific rules to the whole web page by using the body. Excuse me. I'm just saying, hey, target the whole body element. So you can target a very specific HTML element with CSS, just like giving it the name of the element you want it to target. So I'm saying, hey, target the entire body. All of these ones with the dots are classes, targeting a class, right? If I wanted to target an ID, I could switch this from the dot to a pound sign, and that will target an ID, but I want it to be a class. But here I'm targeting the entire body element, and I'm going to tell it, say, text align center, which basically is just saying, hey, put all the text that you see in the web page on the center. So now I kind of got a decent looking game board. Cool. So that's the really crux of like the HTML and the CSS, right? And now, as you can see, we kind of have this dope little like game board, but nothing is interactive about this game board. That's where the JavaScript comes in. And so what we're going to do now is wire this thing up to JavaScript and kind of show how the JavaScript will make this game come to life in a programmatic sense. When a user clicks on the web page, we want to see things kind of happen, right? And JavaScript is what we would use to respond to the different events that the user is interacting with on the web page. Before I do that, there's a very important topic that we have to talk about for a quick second, which is this topic called the document object model, which is what we would colloquially say is an API for working with HTML and XML based documents. The document object model is basically a set of functions that allow us to interact with the with an HTML document using code. So it provides a set of functions that allows us to connect to our to our web pages and look at the entire structure of the HTML document. So basically think of it like we can pass the logic of how our HTML document is structured into our program. And that is what JavaScript would be doing and is responsible for. The Mozilla Developer Networks does a very high level overview of everything going in. It goes really deep. So I guess what you say, you say low level, very low level breakdown of it. I actually like the W3schools' breakdown of this a little bit more. So I'm just gonna show y'all W3schools Dom. Again, the W3schools is an equally good resource for learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you were confused about any of the HTML, CSS stuff, I would recommend spending time through the W3schools on all of those things, HTML, CSS. And then on the JavaScript side, it also has a lot of very helpful information about JavaScript for those that are still learning. But the Code Academy might have done a good job of talking to you a little bit about that stuff too, if you did something like that. Cool. So when we're talking about the DOM, what we're really talking about, like with the API is really doing is representing our HTML document as a tree of objects, right? So I'm sure those of y'all who've studied like data structures are familiar with the tree data structure. The tree data structure is a data structure that starts with a root element, right? And each element built off of that root becomes a child element, right? So here, in this particular context, what we're seeing is the HTML document itself has one element that is known as the root element. Remember, when we were hovering over the HTML tag, it was saying that the HTML tag in an HTML document refers to the root element. This is the first element that will come back when we use the document object model API. This is the part that really is important to understand when it comes to how JavaScript connects to these things. JavaScript can use the document object model to get reference to all of the HTML and the correlating attributes of that HTML. So not only can it pull off the elements themselves, like, oh, we have an HTML tag, which has a head and has a body, and the head has things like the title, and the body has the actual elements we're using, right? It can also pull the attributes that are used on those elements and the styles that are used on those elements as well. So this document object model API is very powerful for any web dev programming language to interact with the HTML page and the actual elements on the web page. JavaScript has a lot of built-in functions that work for the document object model API, and we use them all the time when we're doing web dev work because JavaScript makes it so simple to start interacting with our HTML page, right? So if you, for instance, right, what I'm gonna wanna do is interact with this board. So when something gets clicked on, I want to register what element was actually clicked, and I wanna show something, which means I have to change this HTML somehow. And we would use the document object model to basically target the element that we're looking to change, and then use the correlating JavaScript function to make that change happen. In general, the document object model API for JavaScript, let me zoom out. How do I zoom out of this? The document object model API for JavaScript does a lot of different things. It lets JavaScript change all of the HTML elements in the page, change all the attributes in the page. So remember, any of the attributes are the things that go inside of the elements that are basically saying like, hey, this link is gonna go to this place. The definition of that is the attribute. JavaScript can change all of the CSS on the page. It can remove HTML elements. It can add new elements. It can react to changing events on the HTML elements. And it can even create events on the HTML elements. So that's what JavaScript is important and useful for in the context of anything related to HTML and CSS. So in our case, building out this tic-tac-toe game, we're going to want to have some JavaScript to actually do the interactions. And so we're going to use some document object model functions to do a couple of different things. One, we're going to use them to get a reference to all of these HTML elements that we're going to want to change, right? And we're going to also use the document object model functions to create some JavaScript functions that respond to changes on the HTML document itself. And then lastly, we're going to use the document object model functions to manipulate the HTML to show something else, right? So first, we're going to get a reference to all these elements that we currently have. Then second, we're going to add some event handlers to them that are going to say, hey, when this element got clicked on, let's do something, right? And then third, we're going to manipulate the HTML to change what's presently showing. Those are the three responsibilities of JavaScript with the document object model function. In a nutshell, that's why this tic-tac-toe thing is a really great first project to start with, to get a sense of what you would use JavaScript very specifically to do. Outside of the document object model functions, right, which are very specific JavaScript functions, we use JavaScript as a programming language to handle like logical events, right? Every programming language has Boolean values, conditionals, loops, functions, things, variables, and we use all of those things together to create programs, right? Which are little logic-based tools and systems, right? So, you know, if you know Java or you know any other language, you know that you can create applications that do very specific things based on logic. Same thing with JavaScript. So outside of the document object model utility that we're going to use it for, we also use JavaScript to create the underlying logic behind how things work under the hood, and like just kind of the brain behind how the game and how the page or whatever code is going to run, how that code is going to run. So yeah, so let's just jump right into it. We're going to pull some JavaScript to do those three document object model functions that I just talked about. And we're going to also use JavaScript to actually, you know, store references to our game and, you know, do the actual logic of calculating who the winner is and stuff like that. So again, let's dive in. And I'm gonna just say this now because I'll probably get interrupted with it. Clearly, I'm gonna try to just knock it out as fast as I can. If you want to stick around a little longer and watch me finish it, that's cool. Otherwise, I'll drop the link to the video when I finish later. So, you know, at 9:30ish or whatever, when class is over, if you want to hop, that's cool. But I'll keep going for those of y'all who stay. And for those of y'all that do stay, after I'll answer any questions that you have and walk through the code a little bit more specific. But if you gotta leave, hey, no hard feelings. We're doing it live right now, so you can look at it later. Cool. So dope. For those of y'all who's sticking with me, appreciate you. Let's get to defining some of this JavaScript. And again, a lot of this was defined in the tutorial that Anna Elizabeth did. So again, if you want another like kind of just refresher on this with someone very slowly breaking down all the steps in writing, that's a great tutorial to follow. I'm just trying to tell you more things all at once and live and going through it pretty quick so that you can get a sense of what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, cool. So one of the things that I think will be helpful is kind of just separate out this app into certain sections that will just allow us to more specifically know what we're using the JavaScript to do. So let's just define a couple sections. So the first section is just going to be define application constants, constant variables, right? So we know constant variables, they're variables that don't change. That's one thing we're going to need. Another thing that we're going to need is define application state variables. So these are variables, when I say state variables, these are variables that are going to change over time as the application kind of continues to work. And let's say our first DOM kind of functions, let's say DOM functions. We're going to do some DOM functions for caching element references. So those are going to be the functions that allow us to get a reference to all of the HTML that we're looking at that we have currently defined. Secondly, we're going to do some DOM functions to add event listeners to our elements. So that will be the DOM functions responsible for us basically saying, hey, when I click on that div, do something, right? So we gotta add some event listeners. And then we're gonna have some just general gameplay functions. Cool. And I think that's basically it for how this game kind of gets structured. So again, you know, this is just to give our code some sections. I'm using the multi-line comment as section breaks just to keep the code clean a little bit. And yeah, we're gonna just start defining out a couple of different things in these various sections. First thing is let's just kind of get the gameplay of Tic-Tac-Toe down in our head, right? So Tic-Tac-Toe, it's 3 in a row. You have the board. And on the board, people, I should probably look at our board as I talk, right? We have the board. On the board, people are able to like choose a space that they want to move in. And that space then gets populated with their particular character. So if it was X, we'd see a big X here. If it was O, we see a big O there, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it's a turn-based game. So after one person's turn, it switches to the next person's turn. And the only way that the game stops is after there's no more spaces on the board, and it calculates if somebody's won based on 3 in a row, 3 diagonal, or 3 in a column. So in order for us to make this game work, we already have the board. We're going to need to get a reference of all of these squares on the board so that we can know what square is a user tapping on. Y'all might not know, but I'm tapping on all these, right? To know what square is a user tapping on, whose turn is it, and let's put that person's turn into the board. So there's a couple of things we're going to need to do with JavaScript to do that. And that's all the stuff that we defined here. So first, let's just kind of get some general stuff together for getting this game up and running. We're going to be manipulating the board a lot, right? It's going to change a bunch of times, right? It's not something that's going to stay the same. It's going to start at one thing and then continue to change. So I'm going to say, like, let's create that as state, right? It doesn't really make sense to keep the board as a constant value if everything is going to change. So let's make it something that we put in this kind of application state, like the stuff that will be changing over time inside of our application. So I'm going to create a variable called board. Remember the JavaScript syntax for defining variables. Now that we're using the ES6 syntax is the let constant, which is basically saying, hey, I'm going to create a new variable called board. And it's a general variable that anything within this block of code can make a reference to. So we have the board, and another kind of obvious variable that's going to change a bunch of times as we start interacting with the board is probably somebody's turn. So we can set a variable for turn, and we can set that variable equal to be something like it's X's turn, right? It starts off, turn starts off as X. We're going to set our board up in a little bit and as setup for our game. Cool. So let's actually do that. Let's actually set up the game a little bit more specifically. So what I'm going to do is create a couple of gameplay functions. Typically, a gameplay function would be like if you're building a game, they're the functions that run when the game starts. There are the functions that run as the game is playing. And then there'd be functions that trigger like the ending of a game. Like did something happen that, you know, that we should now check to see if there's a winner or something. So first big important gameplay function is the init function. And so we talked about functions. We didn't really get a chance to talk about functions as a class because we got cut off a couple of weeks ago. But there's a couple of different syntaxes you can use to define functions in JavaScript. This is by far the oldest. I'm using the function keyword, defining the name of the function with parentheses and curly braces. And this syntax is cool, but nowadays we're not really using the function syntax, function keyword syntax like that anymore. We're using a lot of what's called arrow syntax. So I'm gonna just keep that there so that y'all can kind of see what it's doing. But in general, functions these days are being rewritten in what we call arrow syntax, which would be basically a function as a variable. So instead of doing function init, I would create init as a variable that's set equal to what we would call an arrow function. And now this function, this is a function, but it's defined as a variable. And there's a couple of benefits for defining your functions as arrow functions. But for the sake of it, I just want you to know that these two syntaxes exist. For the sake of this particular tutorial, I'm gonna stick with the function keyword just to make things a little bit clearer. Later, when we start talking about React, I'm gonna kind of ditch the function keyword for arrow functions. I just want you to know that they're the same. They're basically doing the same thing of defining a function. A good exercise would be to change your functions to arrow syntaxes after you've defined them, which we could do, but we're kind of pressed for time. So what should happen when our game kind of initializes? What are some of the things that should happen? Well, we probably should let our game board kind of start out being empty, right? We have this board, but we want the board itself to be like when we start to know that the board is empty. And again, this board is going to represent all of this board here. But really what it needs to keep a record of is what is kind of reflected on the board. Is it empty or is it X or is it O? So I think what we could use to reflect on this kind of data structure would probably be a simple array of each of these 9 boxes, right? Each box would have a particular index in the array, and it could either be empty like these ones are now, or it could have X or it could have O in it. So that's the route we're going to go with this init function. Is we're going to initialize the board variable to be an array of different strings. So we're going to start those strings off being empty. And for the sake of making this array clear to us as a board, I'm going to just put 9 empty strings. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But one thing that we could do to make this a little bit easier to read is we could actually like make this look more like a board just by spacing it out. JavaScript doesn't really care about spaces and new lines when you're formatting your code. so long as it can read the expression. So it'll still know that this board is one array. And if I want to fix this a little bit, I can do something like this, right? Or maybe do something like, maybe this would be a little bit easier to read, right? So 9 empty strings, right? And again, at one point, this will be filled with X's and O's and O's and X's, and then we'll use this board to kind of see who's the winner of our game. But for right now, when the game first starts, that array should basically be empty. So we're gonna make that set to empty, and that's really all we need to do for setup. The next thing is we need like some function that's going to be called every time somebody's making a move, like every time a player's played their move, right? So that's what we're going to call this render function. This render function, think of it like a function that runs every time something happens on the actual web page. We're going to re-render the code that's on that particular, that should show up. We're going to render what should show up onto the screen based on anything that's happening in these functions, in the event stuff, or like just things changing in our application state. Like if the board changes, we should re-render, right? If something happens in an event, we should re-render. And so that's what this render function is going to do. In essence, what this function is going to be responsible for doing is iterating through our array of the board and like making sure that the actual code that we see on our HTML is properly mapped to what we should expect it to be based on what's inside of this array. So if I see X, XOX in here, I would expect this function to be able to map it so that XOX is inside of here as well. And that's what that function is going to be responsible for. So at one point, it's going to go through this array and make sure that we see the changes on our actual HTML. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. How are we going to actually connect the JavaScript to see the changes in the HTML? Well, remember, that's where we're going to use these DOM, document object model API functions. So first thing we're going to need to do is get a reference to that game board inside of our HTML code. So we're going to use the DOM function API to basically get a reference to all of the HTML that we've created. But more specifically, we don't need all of this document, right? The real important aspect of the document that we care about really is this, right? It's the board of squares. So we could target this by way of what we did earlier, which was using these different attributes to define these particular elements a little bit more specifically. So remember, we created a big list of divs. We gave them an attribute called class, which makes it so all of these divs share that attribute. And you might not have saw it because I did it kind of quickly, but I created this little board, which was a container around all of those divs. So I have one container containing all of them. And it's called, it has an ID of board, which basically says there's one board that I have kind of an ID associated to, which just contains 9 of these squares. So essentially what we're going to do is use the JavaScript DOM functions to get a reference to that game board and all of the squares inside of it. And so to do that, in order to cache that reference, caching is just a fancy word to say saving for easy access, right? I'm going to create a variable. This is going to be a constant variable because it's not really going to change as much as you might think. This is just, the list itself isn't going to change. The data inside of it might change, but the list itself is going to change. So I'm going to write the line out, and then I'm going to talk about what it's doing in a second. So let me just write the line.
Professor, you're making it in the DOM function comment section?
Yeah, I'm making this. Go ahead.
We have a constant section up top.
Yeah, so let me talk about that in 1 second. That's a great point. Yeah, I'm gonna talk about it literally in 2 seconds. So this is the function. This is an interesting function that's doing a couple interesting things. So let's separate it out a little bit so we can kind of see what's happening a little bit more specifically. What this function is doing. Well, first we're setting a variable. As y'all were just so astutely pointing out, I set it as a constant variable. The reason why this is constant is because technically what this is returning is a list of elements that I want to keep a consistent record of. I don't want that list of elements to ever change. But one thing that's very interesting about JavaScript is list can be constant and the data inside of the list can change. It's a complete kind of, I don't want to curse, but it's a complete it's a complete like reversal of what you would expect a constant thing to mean. In typical other languages, if you declare something as constant, you can't change anything about it, right? You can't change the data inside of it. You can't change the size of the thing. None of that can change. But with JavaScript, if you have a list, you can keep a list constant so long as the list itself doesn't add or remove elements, it's fine. But the data inside of the list itself can, the data that the list is holding, like as long as it keeps the same size and stuff, can change. So I'm keeping this record of squares mostly to just have a consistent record of all of the squares that are going to come back from this DOM function inside of the code. This is our first DOM function, query selector all. If we highlight over it, well, first we see this document dot query selector all. The document that this is referring to is this HTML document that it is connected to, that we're going to connect this JavaScript to in a second. It only will exist in the fact that we're going to connect this document to it. But first thing we're going to do is query selector all, which is a DOM function that returns all the element descendants of a node that match the selectors. So there's a lot of buzzwords. Element descendants, basically think of it like the tree, right? So it's saying you're going to select a node and I'm going to give you all the nodes that are the children of that particular node of it that you were looking for. So in this case, I'm looking for a selector that says board div, right? It says hashtag board div, right? So if I actually want to see kind of what element that would reflect, I could put this in the CSS real quick and see by hovering over this, what's going to get reflected here. So this particular selector is looking for, first of all, it's looking for an element that has the ID board and any div that's inside of that particular ID board. And so what is that going to return? Well, inside of our HTML, right, I created this div with the ID board, and we see all these divs that return that are children inside of that particular div. So it's looking specifically for the children that are divs. So it's going to return all of these squares. The query selector all function is a function that returns as many elements as it can find. There's also a query selector, which is another function, but it only returns the first element of a set of nodes. So query selector all is the one we're going to use because we want all of those squares. The second step, so this first step finds those squares, right? The second step, we're using the constructor syntax for arrays. So think of like classes and object-oriented programming. You can create a new instance of the class. So I'm creating a new instance of an array class and using the .from function, which basically takes any array-like object and turns it into an array. If I were to, I'll show you this in a second, but this returns basically a list of elements that come back, right? So if we hover over query selector all, it says it returns a node list. A node list is basically like a list of HTML elements, and it being a list of elements, it can fit within this array from syntax very simply. And we can basically pass the information that we need from this array list from this node list into this array syntax. And what that will return is a set of all of the squares in a very dope array syntax that we can refer to for the rest of our JavaScript code in a bit. But the first thing we got to do before we can do that is we have to actually connect our HTML page to our JavaScript so that we can test this out in the browser. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is go back to our index.html file. And just like we linked our CSS in our project, we're going to also link our JavaScript file as well. And so JavaScript is very interesting because it uses a specific tag in HTML to be referred to. So I'm going to write that out. It's called the script tag. And the script tag lets you essentially define some JavaScript that's going to run when this script tag gets looked at. So I'm adding this to the head because I'm not particularly defining any JavaScript here. I'm just going to connect it to a particular JavaScript file, right? This file here, the main.js file that we were just working on. I'm going to connect that to our HTML file here. So the way to do that is to pass the source attribute that basically says, okay, hey, I'm going to pass you some file from this folder. VS Code's helping me by saying, okay, what's the file you want to pass into here? So I'm going to say JS, and it says main.js. So now I'm passing inside of the script the source, which basically says what JavaScript file do I want to run, right? I don't want this file to run immediately when it first gets rendered on the browser. So I'm going to also throw another tag in, another attribute in there that's called defer. The defer tag basically prevents this JavaScript, in a short sense, it prevents this JavaScript from running before all the HTML is fully rendered. It'll wait till all the HTML is fully taken care of, and then it'll run the script. I'm only doing this because of where I put this script tag. If I were to put the script tag elsewhere, I could also put the script tag at the bottom of the body. That's fine too. But just for the sake of this example that is connecting a file, I like to put it sometimes in the head depending on what's going on. But yeah, you'll see people put their script tags in different places. Cool. So now that I've connected this this script tag, now I can really start to see some really cool stuff about JavaScript. So in this DOM function, I just told you it was doing a lot of really interesting things. I'm going to do a console log of squares. So remember, the console log function was the print function that we were talking about before when we ran node on all of these JavaScript files, right? But now console log is going to take a whole different meaning now that we have two things happening. One, our whole folder structure is tied to a server. We have a server running and all of the files inside of it are part of the server. Two, we've connected our JavaScript to a HTML file that's actually running, right? There's an HTML document defined here. So three, when we run this code now in the browser, right? The console log is going to happen in the developer browser, the developer tool console, right? So if I go to the console now, you can see that console log just printed out here with all 9 arrays and all 9 elements of this array, which right now are reflected as these different divs. And as you can see, as I highlight over all of them, I'm getting a reference to each of the divs that we just particularly defined in our HTML. Pretty dope stuff. The JavaScript's already kind of aware of all of the HTML inside of there. I think that's pretty cool. But just to kind of make this a little bit more clear what this was doing before that, I'm gonna just show you this in a different way. Let me just comment this out, and I'm going to, let me do it this way. So before we console log out that was the actual array. I'm just going to console log out the return of this document query selector all so that y'all can see what comes back. So you see it comes back. I know it's a little small to read. It comes back with this node list, right? The node list is also looks like kind of like an array. If I opened it up and I highlight over them, it's kind of the same. But what we see is it's just a list that has like index. and an element tied to that index. That's what makes it easy for us to pass it into that array from method. Anything that has that structure of index value, index value, index value can be very easily turned into an array. And so that's what this code was doing. It was taking the result of this, which is just a node list. Remember, node list, that's not really a variable type that we talked about in JavaScript at all, right? What the array method does is takes that node list and turns it into an actual data type that we can work with very easily with JavaScript, which is an array. So now, instead of it being a node list, it's a very basic array, which means that we can do very obvious things that you would think to do with an array, like check how long it is, or different stuff. Return the first element, right? Stuff like that, which is helpful to do because JavaScript as a programming language, we want to use the regular programming language like things we know about it, in conjunction with the stuff we're talking about with the relationship to the actual HTML code. And dope. So that's our first DOM function to get this reference to the element. Let's add another DOM function that is going to give us some ability to, this DOM function gave us the elements. So now let's actually wire up our game to kind of do what we would expect it to do with regard to our board of values. And I have a linter defined on my VS Code. A linter basically is a set of code that defines how like the structure of a document should be. So it actually, it was like, no, I don't like that whole 3x3x3 thing. So I'm going to put it back in one line. But I hope y'all understand that what this board is representing is the actual things inside of here. So what we're doing now is, now that we have a reference to these divs, right? What I want to be able to do is show like X or O in here. And there's a very interesting property of all HTML elements that we can mess with called inner text, which allows us to set like some value of text inside of this particular div. So if I set this to divs inner text, right? You can see like squares at 0 dot inner text equals X gave us this nice big X there. So what I want to basically do is be able to let my board map through all of these elements and fill the board with X's and O's based on what div are we looking at in the array, and what is the actual item supposed to be? Is it an X? Is it an O? Is it an X? And that's what our render function is going to do. It's going to take our board and is going to look through all of the elements inside of the board. So let's just do it now. So arrays are really dope data structures in JavaScript. There's a lot of built-in functions for arrays. Before each function defines a loop for an array, right? So for each basically says, hey, for every element inside of this array, run some function for it. So now what we're going to do is say, okay, cool, take this element. And here we see also that arrow syntax that I was talking about before, where we have kind of like an inline function in here. So it says element, this element is just referred to as, think of it like for every element inside of this array, we're going to see one of these things. For each is an array method that's built in. So we're going to say for each element that we see on the board, let's very specifically give it a, let's specifically change the content of the board like I was just doing in the console. So instead of calling this element, I'm going to call this mark, right? Because think of it like this, like each of these is a mark, X or O or X or O. It's like, you know, I could call it mark, or call it element, I could call it turn, I could call it whatever I want. I think mark kind of makes a little bit more sense, like what mark, who marked that spot, right? For each is a pretty dope function because it takes in a function itself. And we can define two properties of the function as parameters. One is the element that we're looking at, which we can give a specific name to then refer to as a variable, right? So if I wanted to output all of the marks, right? I could do that with this console log like this, but outside of just the element, we can also use another property of the for each function is it passes also the index of the particular element that we're looking at as well. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the particular index I'm looking at. So I'm at as index 0, index 1, index 2. And based on the square that I'm looking at, right, kind of like I did here, based on, well, it updated. Based on the square I'm looking at, I'm going to update it using JavaScript. So essentially what that would look like is I'm going to say squares for each. So for each element, we're going to look back at the squares array that we just got. And we're going to say, hey, squares at that particular index is going to, we're going to change the inner, why is it doing only inner HTML? Oh, my bad. We're going to look at the index. We're going to look at the squares at that index, and we're going to change the text content to be equal to the mark. So whatever this mark was. So if the mark was X, we would expect that the squares at the index 0 that had an X would turn into an X, et cetera, et cetera. So let's pretend our board starts out with X's and O's like this. Then we run these functions. But right now, I defined this init function and this render function, but I never actually called them. So what I'm going to do is inside of the init function, I'm going to have to call this render function to actually run for the first time. So I'm going to say, hey, when you initialize the game board, initialize the board, and then render it on the screen. So then that should come and trigger this function. But then the last thing is I need this, just like any script, right? This function ran because it's kind of defined outside of those functions. But in order to run these functions that I just defined, I need to actually call one of them. So I'm going to call this init function so that it actually runs. So I'm going to say init. So basically that means that as this JavaScript file comes in, all this stuff happens, It says, okay, hey, I see that you defined this function called init. That's cool. I see that you defined this function called render. Hey, that's cool. Just let me know what you want to call it. Oh, you call init, bet. So I'm going to come back in here and then run what's in here. And then it calls the render function. And the render function calls the for each array method, which then, as we will see, goes through and then loops through our big array of squares and changes the text content so that we actually see those values that I kind of hard coded in here as values. So if I add some more, let's just fill it up. I'm gonna fill it up with some random stuff too, so that you can see that no matter what, the text content is going to get flipped to be inside of here, the text content that we would expect, which is cool. We basically are a majority of the way there with this tic-tac-toe game. The rest of it really is in the logic aspect of stuff, which, you know, to a degree, I want to show you, but also to a degree, I'm like, you know, I want to just kind of get you thinking about what the JavaScript is responsible for. That was my main purpose here. The tic-tac-toe game is a pretty interesting game to finish up. What we will want to do now is actually, instead of having this set up at XOXOXOXXXO or whatever, right? We want when the game first starts for this to be initialized to empty. We don't want any actual thing on the board when it first starts. We want the board to be empty because that's what you would expect when you start a new game, is that the board is empty. So the last thing we're going to add today is just add the functionality of letting when a user clicks on the board to allow those updates to show up on the board. And that'll be our last thing. And then if you want to particularly keep working on the logical part of the tic-tac-toe, I encourage you to do so, or to continue following along with Anna Elizabeth's tutorial to kind of get that part going. Maybe I'll kind of make a part 2 of this and then we can do it together. But for right now, I just want to talk more specifically about this other set of DOM functions, which allow us to add JavaScript event handlers and listeners to our elements. So what is an event and a listener? Well, those are really two great questions. An event in JavaScript is referring to any HTML event that that happened on the web page. So I'm gonna just type HTML events and W3schools and just take a look at some of the different events that can happen, right? So there's events for when the page is loading. There's events for all types of things, for things happening in forms, for mouse events, right? So one of the ones we're gonna use is this on click, but think of it like this. HTML elements have events that you can use for different types of processing. So if you're building a game, you might want to use the key down and key press events to kind of figure out what key did they press or whatever. Clicks are very normal events that we use all the time. Another one is drags and drops and stuff like that. All of those events are HTML events that you can put on your elements, and the elements themselves can respond to those changes. The thing is that in order for you to do something about those changes, you need to use JavaScript, right? Because that's what JavaScript is useful for. So when something gets clicked, right, it should call some JavaScript and then say, hey, I just got clicked. What should I do? And JavaScript says, hey, do this, and it'll do that. So last thing we'll do today is just add some event listeners to process clicks happening on our board from any of these various squares inside of the board. And then we'll hopefully get those clicks to think about whose turn it was, right? And based on whose turn it was, we'll show that person's thing. So if it was X, we see O, we should see X. If it's O, we should see O, type thing. So cool. Let's just add those event listener functions. So we just talked about DOM functions for getting element references, but now we're going to use the DOM API to do something slightly different, which is to add event listeners to our particular elements. So again, when you're working with JavaScript and you're using the document object model API, you have to have your JavaScript connected to some document for this to make any sense. In this case, we're already connected to this index.html page. So when I say document, it knows I'm talking about that HTML document that we connected it to. Secondly, you got to use a particular function on that document. So the function we're going to use now is, what we're going to basically do is we're going to get a reference to our board and say, hey, anytime someone clicks on the board, let's process where they clicked and then do something, right? So first we got to just understand the board and get a sense of the board from our document object model. So what we'll do is we're going to say get element by ID. So we're going to use a different function now. Get element query selector all is helpful for getting a bunch of elements from one parent component, one parent element's children. Get element by ID will return the specific element that you're targeting. There's get element by ID. There's get element by class name. Get elements by class name. So remember, classes are not typically multiple elements. So you would, if you use get elements, it'll give you back a node list. But get element by ID is going to return one specific element that we are looking for. And all we got to pass into it is the ID that we're looking for. So remember, I added an ID to this div to be the board. So I said, hey, this big container and on top of this is going to be the board. So when I now say, hey, I want you to get the element by ID that's the board, it's going to very specifically target that particular element. Now, I'm not stopping here. It's not like I want to save anything to this board or anything like that, like I was doing before, or save a reference to it. That's not really my purpose right now. My purpose is whenever someone clicks anywhere in the board, which is this big, think of it like this big square containing all these little squares. Whenever anyone clicks on any of that, I want to process that they clicked. And then I'm going to hopefully add a function that will do some changing of whose turn it is, right? It'll one, put the click down and change the click to say, oh, somebody clicked here, let's add an X. then it'll also change whose turn it is and let that person click and say, oh, or whatever. So in order to do that, because I'm really not trying to, what I'm really trying to do is respond to some change, I want to create an event listener. An event listener is a JavaScript function that gets defined as a function that's going to run when a specific event happens. So the event I'm going to be thinking about right now are clicks. Oops, didn't mean to do that. The event I'm looking to process right now are clicks. Go back to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an event listener, which essentially is saying, hey, okay, cool. You're going to pass in some function that you're going to call as the function when this event gets called, and you're also going to tell me what type of event are you listening for. So first, I'm going to let it know I'm listening for clicks. So I want to know whenever the element clicks. I know I'm going to use clicks because again, this is a event that's defined inside of the HTML DOM. So clicks, drags, drops, all those events are defined. So I can say, hey, I'm looking for clicks. And when the click happens, what function am I going to call? Let's say I'm going to define a new function. I'm going to call it handle turn. I haven't defined it yet, but I'll define it in a second. We're going to call a function called handle turn. And essentially what we want to see happen is whenever someone clicks, this handle turn function gets called. So now I just want to kind of define that handle turn function. So above our little general gameplay functions, I'm going to just create a new function called handle turn. Handle turn is, for right now, let's just say handle turn is going to console log clicked. So I'm going to save that. And now, hopefully, whenever my board gets tapped on, I should see something come up in the console that says, oh, bet somebody just clicked on something. And then from there, we're just going to add some logic to the handle turn to do what we actually wanted to do, which is a little bit more specific to putting some things down in the on the actual board. So I got this list come back. So now let's see. If I click, am I seeing some feedback? I'm seeing some feedback, right? So now my board is aware when it's getting clicked on. I'm clicking on different things and it's coming back and saying clicked, right? This number is just saying that 10 times this same thing got printed, which is dope. That's exactly what I would have expected to see. Now what I want to do though is extend the logic of this handle turn function that's kind of get called to do a little bit more complicated stuff. Well, what do I want it to really do? There's a couple things. First, I wanted to figure out where did it click? Where in the board did it click? What particular square did it click on? So first I want to find the square that it particularly clicked on. Once I find that square, what I want to do then is kind of what we were doing before in the render function. I want the board to know that, hey, it clicked this square. So I want to mark that square to be, I want to mark that square as like that person put their turn down on that particular square. So, and then once I do that, I could just really easily call that render function, right? This render function that we just wrote that will look at the board and say, hey, okay, cool. So this mark should be changed at this index, and it'll change the board hopefully for me. So I don't really got to do much more than make it so that my handle turn can find where it got clicked, what square it got clicked on, and that it changes the board array to say that at that particular index to leave that particular person's turn down as a mark, X or O. So let's add that logic in there, and that'll be the last thing we kind of do for today. And I'll stick around, answer some questions and the like. So first thing we want to do is figure out what index of our board, like what square really got selected or got clicked on. One thing I didn't tell you is event listening functions pass back a very specific object to any function that's defined as the event listener, event handler. Handle turn is our event handling function. That's kind of why we call it handle turn. But we could have called it anything, you know what I'm saying? But any function that gets called as a part of an event listener gets passed a specific object to make use of. It's called an event object. It's a piece of data that comes back into this function just by way of this library. So instead of console logging clicked, I'm going to console log out the actual event so that y'all can see what happens whenever we click. So whenever I click, you can see a new little object is getting sent back to me that has a lot of different properties. It's too much to talk about all of the properties, but let me just say the event object that gets passed is a very helpful object that lets us know specific things. Where on the page are we? What pixels are getting clicked and stuff like that. And secondly, what particular HTML element triggered this particular event to get called, which is what the target represents. So if you give me just a couple minutes, I'm about to wrap up and then I'll take all the questions you got, bro. So now I know that if I look at this target, it's going to tell me that this square was the one that triggered the actual click. So I can very easily make use of that target event.target inside of my code. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to use, now that I know that it comes back with this particular event target, and it will give me what? A square, right? One of the squares that are probably in that squares array that I'm looking at. So I'm going to take this particular square that comes back as the target and compare it to my big array that I took earlier and find out which index which index is this particular square. Once I know that particular index, then I can say, okay, cool. So on the board array at that index, change what the board is holding at that particular index. And then I'll just re-render the board, and hopefully we'll see that change take place. So let's just do those last couple things and we'll be pretty good. So I'm gonna make a new variable. I'm gonna call it let's say let index, and we're gonna create we're gonna find the index. So another array method that's really dope is find index, which basically takes in a particular function for finding a particular element based on some property. So I can say, let's say element. So find index says, okay, for each element that I'm gonna look at, I'm gonna run this function, and you just let me know if this function, whatever this function returns is what I'm gonna say I found. So what I wanna find is the element inside of this squares array. Remember, the squares array is this big constant value of all the squares we got back from before. I'm gonna say, okay, cool. Find the element, or maybe element's not the best term, maybe square. Find the square that is the same as that event.target that we were talking about, or that we just saw earlier. So I'm gonna say return the square that is equal to event.target, right? And so we know that event.target is gonna bring back a square. We know we have an array of all of the squares, right? That's up here, this array of all of the squares, right? And with that being noticed, right? We're gonna find the same square that correlates to the target that's there as well. And so what we're gonna do now is that's what this function is doing. Returning, hey, where is this square equal to the event target? It's gonna go through all of the squares and it's gonna either say yes or no. Once it says yes, it's gonna return and it's gonna give us the index of that particular element. So now that I have the index, I can do one last thing, which is tell my board array at that particular index to be set to whosever turn it was, right? X or O. Right now, turn is at X, so it's gonna set the board index to whoever's turn it was, X or O. Then I'm gonna just do some conditional logic, and I'm gonna say if turn is equal to X, right? Let's just set turn to O, and then else turn gets X, right? And then after it does that, we'll just re-render the board and say, okay, cool. We'll render the board. Now that we changed this, now that we changed the board, we should see some changes. So now our handle turn is a little bit more sophisticated. So let's see what's going on now. If I click, see an X. If I click again, see an O. Click, see an X, see an O, see an X. And we got our little tic-tac-toe game kind of up and running. The last steps, like I mentioned, are the logical part. So now you don't really, now you have all of the JavaScript DOM-like things that you want to get going. The last couple stages of this game would be, you know, defining like winning combos, right? Which is like some array of all of the values that are possible for winning the game. Like how do you win tic-tac-toe? You got to have like a specific set of combinations, right? And now you can build some more functions that will determine whether or not someone's won or whether or not somebody is, if it was a cats game, if you want to reset the board, you can make as many new functions as you want. But we have the basic gameplay functions down for a tic-tac-toe game. We are our board showing up with HTML. And we use a couple different HTML. We mostly use divs and some CSS to make the board. We went a little quickly through the CSS portion. Like I said, I might talk a little bit about that another time, but the most important thing was to know that we can link CSS to HTML and we can link JavaScript files to our HTML as well. Using these class and ID attributes are really important because we can make reference to those particular elements in those CSS and JavaScript files very commonly, right? ID attribute and class attribute. And we see that in the form of like the selectors that we use, as well as in the selector in the CSS sense are what element is going to get returned from the rule we're defining, right? We see the CSS come to that, and we also see it in the JavaScript DOM, where we can query for different elements based on their ID and based on their class. And we can also do some very specific things, like after we found that particular element, adding an event listener or doing some more JavaScript related functions to those elements themselves. And yes. And that's it. That's kind of what JavaScript is useful for. We add JavaScript to HTML and CSS to add kind of logical functions to our games or to our programs, especially on our websites, right? To make the website more interactive, you need some logic and things to happen. JavaScript makes that possible. But as you can see, all three of these files are very necessary. When we start talking a little bit more about React and the JavaScript behind React, these same topics come up 100% in everything we're doing in React. Most people start React off just jumping into React, but without kind of having this baseline knowledge, you kind of miss the point of what's really happening with some of those newer frameworks. And so hopefully this is helpful. And like I mentioned, I'm gonna stick around, answer some questions, and I'm grateful for those of y'all that stuck around. And for anybody that watches this later, I appreciate you too. So yeah, I'm gonna stop and I'm going